Welcome back to Blue Pyramid Stories, and now the conclusion to How Scotland Tried to Kill Me. So as you'll recall from our last discussion, I was sitting on a bench waiting for debate rounds to begin, heaving over the side of this 550-year-old bench while trying to find some equilibrium where my back would not be in too much excruciating pain. So eventually the round started, and I was able to, in parliamentary debate, you have to ask questions during the round, sort of by standing up and making a gesture like this that is supposed to symbolize the sort of old parliamentary habit of wearing wigs and having to hold your wig while you rose and extended your arm to the speaker to ask them a question. So I got permission because of my back not reacting very well to standing up and down and snapping back and forth to ask points of information from my seat. But I had to speak and give my speeches as normal, and I was sort of hunched over, back bent in half over the podium or the table or wherever we were speaking from. And somehow managed to get through 2 or maybe 3 rounds. I think there were only 2. I think they actually canceled a full round to keep to schedule because the spontaneous flu incident was so bad. And finally, we were able to trudge home, and I actually got a seat on the bus going home, thankfully, and immediately went to bed and slept for a very long time. And that night, there was a New Year's Eve party and the celebration of who actually made the elimination rounds. And I had been very much looking forward to this because we were in contention, but I obviously was not going to go to anything more than that which was strictly required for the tournament. So I sat out, and it turned out we made the elimination rounds, and about 3 in the morning people came back and knocked on my door, and I sort of woke up in a haze, and people were celebrating and cheering and came in and said, "You guys made the break," and it was exciting, but I was also bleary and had to throw up a little bit more, and it's not in particularly good shape, and was very relieved that the next day was New Year's Day and we had the entire day off. Well, a little premature this amount of relief turned out to be, because it turns out that on New Year's Day, absolutely everything in the United Kingdom shuts down completely. It just closes. There's nothing available. And that would have been fine if the tournament had made some sort of provision or arrangement for us to be able to eat such that we could survive in Scotland. But they didn't make such a provision. So we ended up having to basically fend for ourselves. And since no one had prepared for this and everything was completely shut down, and nobody really knew how to hunt wildlife in Scotland, and I'm a vegetarian anyway, so that wouldn't have done much good, and it was a little too cold to forage for anything that might be growing outside, we had to make do with the only thing available to us. And the only thing available to us was a vending machine in one of the common rooms down the hall from this row of dorms that we were all staying in. And that would have been fine, except none of us had any change, because we hadn't exactly been getting a lot or stockpiling a lot of change in the British currency. And there weren't any change machines in the lounge where this vending machine was. So we were sitting there on New Year's. I was in very bad shape. Most of us were doing very poorly. And we had no food. And we were sort of really sitting there contemplating, like, maybe we're going to be holed up and end up starving to death. And this dorm was sort of, remote enough from the city that there wasn't really anywhere we could walk to, even if something were open. So, which is why we'd been taking these 25-minute buses. So we sort of weighed the morality and the ethics of the situation and came to the possibly dubious conclusion that if we could somehow extract candy and snacks from the vending machine without the explicit use of British currency, that would be justified to keep ourselves alive and in some condition of health for debating the next day, because everything was closed. So inevitably, I, with my small wrists, was employed to be the point person in securing this bounty for ourselves. And if I had been in any better shape or any less bitter at Scotland or the tournament, or my condition at the time, I probably would have sat it out and said, well, we can't really steal from the vending machine. But as it was, it presented kind of a challenge, and I was fed up, and so I decided to go for it and join in. And so we posted Zimmy, our legally blind friend, as a lookout, and promptly set about to try to, figure out how I could manipulate the contraption of the vending machine such that I could stick my very thin arms up through the machine's, dispensary bottom and get to the candy. Well, it turned out that the bottom row was just this sort of lineup of various sort of lifesaver type candies. They had these things called polos that are basically lifesavers, and not to be confused with Rolos, which they did not have, and some sort of like gum and some other things like this. So I was able to get my, there wasn't one of those guards to catch and like pinch your arm if you tried to steal candy in this way. And so I was able to, contort my arm and get it up through such that I could just sort of flick out these candies very quickly. And so we stockpiled a bunch of these. But unsurprisingly, lifesaver type candies, not particularly sustainable, not particularly helpful when you're starving to death on New Year's in Scotland. So we had to find a way to get at the really good stuff, the chocolate and the, bags of chips and the snacky stuff that was higher up in the machine and was held back by the sort of inevitable metal bar. And my arm just wouldn't go up that far, it bent at the elbow, like it wouldn't go up that far within the machine and without cutting off sort of at the shoulder. So we had to figure out a way to do this. And my friend Russ, who was the other sort of lead person who was helping me out with all of this, while Zimmy kept a lookout and occasionally flinched at shadows and said, I think someone's coming, and we're like, no, that's just a change in the light. Russ decides that he has brought a metal coat hanger. This is pre-September 11th, of course. And he had a metal coat hanger in his luggage that he had brought, and he's going to manipulate this. And immediately, somehow, because we were all giddy and punch-drunk and starving, we decided to, start narrating our adventures as though they were a role-playing game. So I was, the young adventurer going about and had gone through all of these setbacks and was on the verge of death. And I visited my friend Russ the Hangersmith, and I had in my, knapsack a polo, and I trade him 2 polos for a hanger of infinite bending might. And so he had, contorted the hanger in a certain way such that it would loop around chocolate bars and I could sneak it in there, manipulate it briefly so it would hook things in once it was already in the machine, and then use it to yank down chocolate bars over their metal rings. Remarkably, this was very effective, and a lot of them would sort of bend in half and then sort of flip over in one way or another over the metal bar. So they didn't often come down in one piece, but maybe in a couple pieces, and sort of sequentially we had to use a lot of attrition to get through it. But eventually we ended up building up quite a stockpile, and periodically every 2 or 3 or 4 candy pulls something would happen to manipulate the hanger, or it would almost get caught completely on one of the candy bars or another. And so I would have to again revisit my friend Russ the Hangersmith and trade him a chocolate for repair to hanger. Your hanger is now repaired and ready for use. And then I returned to do my adventuring. By the time we were done with this little excursion, and no one ever came because no one was working in the dorm because it was New Year's and absolutely everything was shut down, we'd amassed sort of this mountain of chocolate and a few other snacks. Everyone was pretty well gorged, although not in a way that's very helpful because it wasn't really substantial food. And the vending machine was just barren in the front row of almost every single slot that you could get to. There were a few places in the top. So basically anyone who put money in whatsoever would just watch the wheel spin around and not yield them anything. So probably objectively one of the worst things that I've ever done with my life, but perhaps a justified reaction to attempted murder on Scotland's behalf. We did very much later that day, end up finding a place that served Indian pizza that delivered starting at about 8 p.m. on New Year's Day, and we got some of that looked and smelled just about as good as it sounds. It was terrible. It basically was this nuclear yellow dyed ridiculousness on sort of pita-ish flatbread. But you know what? It was food, and we didn't even have to steal it. The rest of the tournament was not particularly eventful. We had a round about genetically modified foods, and I cracked a lot of jokes about genetically modified foods not being the only kind of food to worry about in Scotland at the time. That didn't really go over too well, and we didn't make the next elimination round. And eventually, we, tired and bitter and broken, went home. And I swore at that point that so long as I could help it, I would never enter Scotland again. This has been Blue Pyramid Stories. I'm Storey Clayton. Thanks for listening. Good night.